All right, Genesis 39, let's call this some good choices. Why? Because this chapter seems to help us see the ways in which good choices survive hard times, which is exactly what we find Joseph doing here when the story turns back to him and we see him now having been sold into slavery by his brothers in the service of a man by the name of Potiphar. And if you roughly know how this story turns out, you realize that Potiphar sees something beginning around verse 2, and that is the Lord was with Joseph. That catches Potiphar's attention. Potiphar puts Joseph in charge of his house, and his house is blessed because of Joseph. However, one of the first things to notice is that good choices can sometimes lead you into short-term negative consequences, because Potiphar's wife will not only notice that the Lord is with Joseph, she's going to notice that Joseph is good looking, and she's going to put him in a tough situation. However, his good choices are going to be demonstrated by the way he responds to that situation and simply moving away from that temptation. And ultimately, that's going to put him at odds with Potiphar's wife and land him in prison. And so one of the things we want to do early on is not be discouraged when actually showing integrity gets us in trouble. Why? Because once he lands in the jailer is going to notice the same thing. Verse 21, the Lord was with Joseph. Likewise, the jailer is going to put him in charge of the jail. And because of Joseph, the jail is going to be blessed. And so we're going to see in Joseph an example of a man who is not simply Abraham's biological descendant, but his descendant in integrity and his choice to walk closely in the ways that God is asking him to walk. Is he the only biological descendant of Abraham and his family? No, he's got 11 brothers who are showing a tendency to lean into shady character. And so even though they are materially going to be blessed, they are not spiritually blessed in the ways that are going to be obvious in the life of Joseph. That's going to go back to his father Jacob, who, even though he set a shady example for 11 of those boys, ultimately the fact that he's going to choose to right his walk in the service of Laban is going to have Laban notice that God is with Jacob. Going back to Isaac, it's going to be the same thing, even though Isaac has some clear character defects. Isaac is going to walk in God's ways in a manner that helps the people around him, in particular, a king by the name of Abimelech. Notice that God is with Isaac, and it goes back to Abraham, who negotiated with the same Abimelech. And even though he lied to get himself out of trouble, Abimelech is still going to see the dominant strain of his character is one that God is blessing, and his integrity and his choice to not only walk in the ways that God has told him to walk, or meaning the direction, he's going to walk in the methods, meaning the statutes and the ordinances that God has laid down for his manner of living. And that's going to attract not only Abimelech's attention, but a righteous king by the name of Melchizedek, who we mentioned before. They're all going to see that God is with Abraham. And now that we're in chapter 39, we're going to see how Joseph is not simply a biological descendant of Abraham. He is in many ways choosing the level of integrity that Abraham chose to use in walking with God. And like we said, it can get him in trouble, but it's going to survive all of those difficulties because everywhere he goes, his integrity is going to attract the level of blessing from God that's obvious to even non-believers. And so understand, he is an interesting contrast to two people in this story. One, his father, because Jacob choosing to politic a situation. He's going to politic a blessing away from his brother, as we've talked about before. And it's going to lead him into 20 years in the service of a man who loves to politic. And so he is going to have to basically weave out of a circumstance where his politicking got him short-term gains, but long-term servitude. Jacob is going to be a contrast to Joseph, who chooses the short-term suffering of integrity that has God making the blessings on his life obvious everywhere he goes, no matter what the retaliation is. And so that's what happens in contrast to Potiphar's wife. Potiphar's wife is an individual who uses her position in the household to get rid of Joseph, not realizing that in the process, she's hurting her own household because God is blessing her household because of Joseph. There's a verse in the Proverbs that says, every wise woman builds up her own house, but the foolish with her own hands tears it down. And it's so similar to a verse in the Proverbs we've already looked at, which says, when a man's folly brings his way to ruin, his heart rages against the Lord. And those are two passages that seem to show us the ways in which politicking, either within a family or an organization, can actually bait us into tearing down our own ambitions. Joseph, on the other hand, seems to be demonstrating the way that the kind of faith that chooses integrity can provoke God to make it absolutely clear how good choices survive hard times.